Hello everyone, this is the second video looking at citizens' rights in part of the democracy module, and in the previous video I spent some time discussing this idea of individual versus collective rights, and you should try and understand this topic before continuing with this video. Now, perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of individual versus collective rights, other than coronavirus, which I mentioned in the previous video, is the idea of identity cards. Now, under the Blair and Brown governments, particularly the Brown government, there was a big push that all citizens should have an ID card that you carry around in your wallet, a bit like a driver's license, but this time it was kind of enforced by the government that you have to have some sort of ID card. And the man on the card there, if I make myself look bigger, is called Alan Johnson, and he was the Labour Home Secretary for quite some time under Gordon Brown. And there had been some terrorist attacks that I had mentioned. And so one of the ideas that came up was the idea that all British citizens should have some sort of identity card to show who we were. And so when there were issues with suggestions of illegal immigration or suggestions of people coming from abroad with a view to kind of attack people, that these cards in some way would protect us. It was never entirely clear exactly when and where these cards would be used. So would you use them to go onto public transport, or would you use them to buy things in shops, or when would you have to use them? Or if a policeman came to you and said, well, I need to see your ID card, would that be something you'd have to produce? But the idea was that these would protect us in some way. Some people think the idea is very useful and very important and could be used in lots of different useful ways. Other people felt that this would, forcing us to carry a card, would infringe on our rights. And when the Conservative government came to power in 2010, and I mean the coalition government here, it was very quickly scrapped. The Liberal Democrats have never been a fan of identity cards because, as you might know from the word Liberal Democrats, the first part of liberal is liberty, which is freedom. And if you're forced to carry a card, that's not particularly free. So for one of your optional extension tasks this week, spend a bit of time Googling this idea of a national identity card. It comes up every so often, and there are passionate arguments on each side. The Conservatives are nearly always against it from the point of view of freedoms, but they are often for it from the point of view of security. The Lib Dems are nearly always against it. Labour kind of goes this way or that way. It's come up again with the idea of coronavirus vaccine passport cards or some sort of coronavirus passport. So the idea that you have some sort of card or online thing that says, yes, you've had a vaccine, you're safe to come into this pub, this theatre, this public venue where lots of people are. And the idea is that by having some sort of card or passport, we can ensure that the collective group is safe from coronavirus. Hooray. But then that potentially infringes on the rights of the individual to not have to have their personal details uploaded or carry around something with their photograph on it or register to some sort of scheme. Now, I'm sure there are some of you watching this that will be sitting there kind of going, well, what's the problem with carrying a card? What's the issue? And there'll be others of you sitting here watching this kind of going, I don't want to carry a card. I don't want the government knowing all my details. I don't want to have to register for this or that. And this is the one of the clashes and the contrasts that we have in our country regarding this issue, is that there are some people that don't mind, but there are some people that feel very passionately on both sides of this argument. I wouldn't be surprised, £10 bet, I wouldn't be surprised if some sort of ID card scheme comes along as a result of coronavirus. And I also wouldn't be surprised if it's controversial. And I also wouldn't be surprised if, touch wood, there's another terrorist attack if this issue kind of comes back again. Maybe, let's go crazy, maybe in the future it won't be a card. Maybe technology will reach a certain time where you have to have some sort of implant in your hand, and you have to beat your hand against something. What people get very upset about the government knowing things about our internet history or our financial circumstances or our emails or things like this, and an ID card would kind of build into that idea. On the other side, it could help to protect. It could be very, very convenient, and if you have nothing to hide, why is it a problem? Interesting debate. Now, sometimes when talking about the issues of rights, the word that often goes with the word rights is the word responsibility. And sometimes people argue that in order to have rights, you should fulfill your responsibilities. So let's use some silly examples from school. If you want to have the freedom to eat your own lunches outside of the canteen, then your responsibility is to clean up the sixth form common room. If you want to have the right to wear your own clothes, you need to be responsible enough to wear appropriate clothing, or something like that. I'm using school examples, but I'm sure you get the idea that the idea goes that if you want to have the privilege of your rights, you also need to fulfill your obligations. And some people have suggested that all UK citizens have a large amount of responsibilities that should be fulfilled. Let's see what you think about these. I'm sure when I give you a list of responsibilities here, there'll be many of them that you'll be like, yeah, of course. And others that you'll be like, oh, I'm not so sure. So this will be good for our debates and discussions. Do we have a responsibility to obey the laws? All the laws. What about the laws you disagree with? To what extent do you have to obey the laws? When would be a circumstance in which you would obey a law? When would be a circumstance in which you would not obey a law? Pay taxes. Do you have a responsibility to go out and earn money and then to take a big chunk of that money and give it to the government? Is that a responsibility that you should have in this country? And if it is your responsibility, would you lose rights if you don't? So, for example, if you don't pay your taxes, should you lose your right to healthcare? For argument's sake, you can see the lines I'm drawing, the connections. Jury duty. Our country is based on a legal principle that citizens should be tried by their fellow citizens. So, i.e., a jury is made up of normal people who will decide whether another normal person should lose their freedom. Some people are really upset about the idea of having to do jury duty, and they object and they write back and they say, I'm not doing it, and things like that. Should that be part of your responsibility? Do you have a responsibility to care for your children? Let's say if you have a child and then you don't want that child and you just want to kind of pass it on to the government, like, do you then have to have a responsibility to care for it or financially care for it? Like, where do your responsibilities begin and end, and where does the government's responsibilities begin and end on these things? To serve in the army. What if the country is attacked? Do you, me, have a responsibility to join the army if required? If conscription came along, which is where you are forced to join the army, should I have to do it? One from last week. Is one of our responsibilities to vote? And if we don't vote, how does that impact our rights? Not at all? Or should there be a kind of a cost, a political cost to it in some way? You have the responsibility to respect the rights of others. To what extent is that true? So we've talked about different types of rights and responsibility. Like, do we have a responsibility to then respect those rights for others? And do you have a responsibility to follow the values of the country, the freedoms, tolerance, democracy, all those kind of things? And if you disagree with them, are you allowed to campaign against them or not? Very thought-provoking slide, this one, I think. Worth having a little think about it and thinking which ones you agree with or where the exceptions might be. And remember that question: to what extent are citizens' rights tied to their responsibilities? Like, would you just say, actually, no, these are two completely different threads and there is no way that your rights are connected to your responsibilities? Or would you say that actually, yeah, if you want to have the right to use my example, to an NHS, you need to contribute to taxes and things like that. Another example might be if you pay national insurance or you don't pay national insurance, do you have a right to unemployment benefit or whatever they've named it these days, universal credit and things like that. And you can see here, to what extent should you lose your rights if you fail in your responsibilities? So let's talk in general about rights in the UK. How good are we as a country at giving citizens rights and protecting those rights, whatever they may be? And I've got a slide here that gives you some examples of rights, but I think we kind of know that we're freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of freedom, and so on. What's good about our country? Well, first of all, we have the Human Rights Act. It was put into law in 1998. We have enshrined our rights in UK law, so we all know what they are, and courts can make rulings of them. On the back of that, another strength is we have an independent judiciary and a judicial review system. If the government puts in a policy that perhaps infringes your rights, the courts will look at that and they will make a judgment in a review process and make a ruling. This is why judicial independence and judicial neutrality is perhaps seen as so important. So this is why judicial independence and judicial neutrality is seen as so important, because if a if the judges are in some way connected to the executive, then how can they be the ones that protect you from that protect your rights when the executive makes certain decisions? So that is a key part. The separation of powers. Let's get all these kind of key phrases back in together. The separation of powers is seen as a very key principle of UK democracy, because without that separation between the judges and the executive, then how can the judges protect you from them? Going back to last week's topics, pressure groups are a huge part of campaigning to protect rights, and making note of when the rights are infringed, and campaigning for extensions to these rights. And one of the most important pressure groups that has been involved in citizens' rights is a group called Liberty. They're historically important, and they're still currently important. And when you go on to one of the next slides, you'll see that I've put this website for you to spend 10 minutes or so kind of looking through and seeing the kinds of things that they have done. But equally, you could put in other groups such as the NAACP in America. You could bring in Stonewall, you could bring in race relations organizations. There are lots of organizations that have campaigned to protect rights, including, of course, Charter 88, which argues that we should have a constitutional Bill of Rights. And students always forget this one, and I'll admit, so do I. Often, Parliament itself also protects rights. Now, remember, although in our country the government and Parliament are fused, they are not identical. And so it is entirely possible for the government to say, we want to change the rights on detaining terrorist suspects, and Parliament, the rest of the MPs, to say, no, we're not doing it. And there's a whole bunch of examples in the textbook that I'd like you to have a look at that give you case studies of this idea that actually Parliament itself can be and should be the check on the executive that protects citizens' rights. So how good do you think that is? How strong are these strengths? I hope you're kind of processing this and thinking and evaluating. Because now we're going to look at the weaknesses. What do we think? What knocks down our country when it comes to the protection of rights? The first one, and perhaps the most important one, is this. Although we have the Human Rights Act, it is a law, but it is only a law which is identical in stature to every other UK law. It doesn't outweigh any other laws, and it has no special protections. Now, let me use a contrast here with America. In America, they have constitutional laws and other laws, and they're sometimes known as higher laws and lower laws, or upper and lower laws, or something like that. And we've used last year the term entrenched laws and codified laws, and I'm hoping you know what those terms mean. But in America, the Bill of Rights is codified and entrenched. Codified, all written down. Entrenched, very, very, very hard to change. To change an entrenched law, they need a supermajority in their Congress, and then it has to be processed by going all the way around all the different states, and 3/4 of the states have to then ratify that change. So it is very hard to change a constitutional law, but it's very easy to change another law. You simply need a majority in both houses, which granted isn't that easy, but you just need a majority in both houses and you can change a law. Now, in the UK, there is no such thing as a constitutional law. We have no codified entrenched constitution. So all laws are laws. And any law can be changed by Parliament. And if I go back to this slide here, the point being here, none of the laws, including the Human Rights Act, outweigh any other laws, which means it can be changed at any time, it can be modified at any time, and it can even be overruled by other laws. Now, on the back of that, that means that our UK Parliament can and has often ignored the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act, which, if you remember, is the same, a very, very similar document, was moved into kind of UK law. And the case study we're going to use for this is a case called the Belmarsh case, and I'm going to put that in a separate video, a separate case study. But there are multiple cases where the Parliament has ignored the rights that in theory their citizens have. Another one might be prisoner voting. We looked at that last week. Citizens have the right to vote regardless of whether they are prisoners or whether they are not. But our country has decided to ignore that right, perhaps for good reason, but they have decided to ignore that right and infringe on their rights. So look out for the next case study on Belmarsh. The next argument is that although we have a Supreme Court, and although that Supreme Court can make rulings, the Supreme Court in the UK cannot strike down an existing law by the government. They can in America. If in America, the Supreme Court makes a ruling that says a new law is incompatible with the Bill of Rights. That law is gone. It's called, the word is quashed. That law is gone. But in the UK, as you should know from our judiciary unit, they make a declaration of incompatibility saying this law is not compatible with this law. So the Human Rights Act is not compatible with this new law on terrorist suspects, or the Human Rights Act is not compatible with this massive lockdown you've just done for citizens for the last year. But neither law is struck down by the Supreme Court. It is then up to the government to decide to fix this issue, or just to ignore it and go, well, we're just going to have these two laws. So the Supreme Court's power to protect our rights is limited. That's the point I'm making. It is the Supreme Court's power can only go so far. And even if the Supreme Court does make a ruling, that ruling can be bypassed with future legislation. And you'll see this again in the Belmarsh case. But let's say the Supreme Court says, well, actually, this lockdown you've done in March 2021 is illegal according to the Human Rights Act. And then the government goes, oh, right, it's illegal. The government can then just make a new law to make it legal, because the government can always make a new law because there's no constitution, no code of rights, etc., etc. So you could make the argument that it is relatively easy for a government to modify the UK laws, to modify our rights and to modify the ability of the Supreme Court to be able to protect those rights. And this is more of a general point, but international terrorism and attacks like that put pressure on rights, as does coronavirus, as does any kind of event that threatens the collective rights. And remember, go back to that idea of collective rights versus individual rights. Anything that threatens the majority tends to put pressure on individuals and put pressure on the government to create laws that will push back on that issue. Now, for the last slide today, there has been a campaign, particularly amongst Conservative MPs, to replace the Human Rights Act in 1998 with a British Bill of Rights. And the argument goes like this. The argument says, well, the European Convention of Human Rights was something that was made at a European level, which is suitable for the whole of Europe, and it was made as a result of what happened in the Holocaust and all sorts of horrible things in World War II. And it is not suitable for Britain. There are many parts of it that are very good and many parts of it that are very important, but actually it would be better that Britain had something which was tailored specifically towards British citizens. And so the argument that goes is that we should get rid of the Human Rights Act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights, which is customized towards Britain. And I've got 3 links here, which I will put in the Nearpod links for you to have a look at, but I'll just load up one of them. And it argues that we need something which is more customizable for us. For example, it's often been argued that the Human Rights Act protects, in quotes, and I'm not saying this, but you can make the judgment here. There's often an argument that the Human Rights Act protects bad people. It protects people that demand a fair trial when they've just blown something up, or they're spreading kind of intolerant hate, and then the Human Rights Act protects their ability to stay in the country and things like that. And so it's been argued that we need a British Bill of Rights that is what some politicians would say is a lot more sensible. I don't know. I'm not sure I like that word, but Theresa May was going to do it when she was Home Secretary. She wanted to replace the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. And there have been several campaigns to do that. So read through the documents and see what you think. On the other side, other campaigners argue that regardless of the situation, all human rights should be protected. So thanks for watching this week. I'll do one final clip looking at the Belmarsh case study, and I'll give you some links on that. Fill out the activities, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.